I don't know how much longer I have. Even now, as I force myself to stay awake, I can feel sleep tugging at the edges of my mind like a tide that never recedes. My body is shutting down. Not from pain, not from illness as we once understood it, but from something far worse. Something inevitable. It started small, a strange affliction that no one paid attention to. A few cases here and there, people who slept too much, who couldn't keep their eyes open no matter how much they had rested. At first, doctors dismissed it as exhaustion, the byproduct of modern life grinding people into dust. But when those people never woke up, even as feeding tubes were forced down their throats, even as their bodies withered, we understood. Too late, but we understood. They called it the sleeping sickness, though that name barely scraped the surface of the horror it was to lose people to it. It had no clear cause, no vector of transmission, no patient zero to trace. People just started sleeping. It took months for anyone to sound the alarm because it didn't kill quickly. It wasn't a fever that raged or a virus that burned through populations. It was slow, cruel, a thief in the night. At first it was dismissed as isolated cases, rare, tragic abnormalities. Then it spread. Families found their loved ones impossible to rouse. Entire workspaces went silent as employees dozed at their desks, never to wake again. By the time the government finally acknowledged it as an epidemic, a third of the population was already drifting beyond reach. The world fell apart in increments. Pilots never landed their planes. Surgeons never finished their incisions. Power grids failed when their engineers never woke to maintain them. The cities fell into silence, punctuated only by the hum of abandoned machines and the cries of those still awake, those who knew their time was coming. And now it's me. I feel it gnawing at me, the unshakable weight behind my eyes, my body slowing. My hunger fades and thirst dulls. My days are measured in hours of wakefulness, not in what I accomplish anymore. The longest sleepers had existed in the state for 8 months at the pandemic's peak. But they had machines keeping them alive. I have no one. But before I do, before I close my eyes for the last time, I need to tell you a story. Someone out there needs to know how everything happened. What came of this? Someone has to know that we were here, even if there is no one left to read it. I first heard about the sleeping sickness whilst I was at work. I remember exactly where I was, scraping algae off of the inside of a sea lion tank, the stink of fish and salt water clinging to my clothes. The radio was on in the staff lounge, playing in the background like it always did. The voices of news anchors blending into the hum of everyday life. They mentioned it in passing, a few cases popping up in different parts of the country. Some new kind of sleep disorder, maybe neurological, maybe psychological. The details were vague, the concern minimal. I didn't think much of it. Pandemics had come and gone before. I figured someone in a lab would put their heads together, whip up a vaccine, and in 6 months, we'd all have another cautionary tale to tell. I wasn't alone in that thinking. Life moved on. People still went to work, still packed themselves into subways and shopping malls, still visited places like the zoo. Then came the incident. It was a Saturday, I think. We were packed with weekend visitors, kids running ahead of tired parents, teenagers snapping selfies in front of the lion enclosure. I was finishing my break when I heard the first scream. At first, I thought maybe someone had dropped their phone over a railing, or maybe a kid had climbed too high on one of the fences. That sort of thing happened all of the time. But then more people started shouting and running. I pushed through the crowd, following their wide-eyed stares to the crocodile enclosure. And there, floating face down in the water, was a man. He was a big guy, easily over 6 feet tall, broad shoulders like a linebacker. At first I thought he had jumped, but then I had heard the murmurs, the frantic whispers from the people around me. He just fell asleep, right over the railing, didn't even make a sound. I looked up at where he had been standing, at the metal barrier overlooking the water. It was easy to see how it happened. If he had been leaning forward when it hit him, if his body had just given out mid-step. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I saw movement in the water. The crocodiles had noticed him. The staff rushed in, but it was too late. I won't describe what happened next. You can probably imagine. But I will tell you this. When they finally got him out, when what was left of him was dragged onto the pavement, his eyes were open. The water had awoken him, for a few moments at least. That was the moment the sickness became real to me. It wasn't just something happening in hospitals or cities far away, it was here, in front of me. And it was unstoppable. I relive that moment every time I close my eyes. As more people succumbed, the world grew quieter. Hospitals overflowed with the sleeping. At first they tried to keep them alive, machines breathing for them, tubes feeding them. But there were too many, and every day more doctors and nurses fell asleep at their posts. There weren't enough hands to keep their bodies warm, to keep their hearts beating, to stop the slow, inevitable decay. Eventually, we had to admit the truth. We had to stop wasting resources on those who would never wake. The focus had to be on those living. Scientists worked day and night, but even those who managed to stay awake could only watch helplessly as their colleagues, one by one, drifted away. No bacteria, no virus, no parasite, nothing that could be detected under a microscope. No environmental link, no common exposure. It struck rich and poor, young and old, healthy and sick alike. Every theory fell apart under scrutiny. Every desperate cure amounted to nothing. And so, as the world crumbled around me, I did the only thing I could. I worked. Despite the traumatic experience, the zoo became my refuge. As my colleagues stopped showing up, as their numbers dwindled from dozens to a handful to only me, I took on their duties. Feeding, cleaning, maintaining enclosures. The routines kept me sane, gave me something to hold on to while everything else slipped away. The animals still needed care, and unlike us, they were unaffected. That was something people started noticing all over the world. No animals were falling asleep more than usual. Not the pets curled up at the feet of their unconscious owners. Not the livestock wandering unattended in fields. Not the scavengers feasting on the dead. That last part was what haunted people the most. The news in those beginning months became more horrifying than ever. When there was still enough people left to report on what was happening, they showed footage of farmland where workers had collapsed mid-task, their bodies left where they fell. Herds of cattle stepped over them unbothered. Birds picked at their open eyes. Packs of dogs, abandoned by their owners, turned feral. I didn't blame the animals. It was easy to be horrified at first, seeing the footage of half-eaten bodies, of packs of dogs tearing into the fallen, of crows pecking at the faces of those who had simply laid down in the streets and never woken up. But the animals weren't cruel. They weren't capable of cruelty in the way we were. They were just hungry. They were surviving. And in a way, a strange way, I found comfort in that. It meant that when my time came, the animals I had cared for, my animals, wouldn't suffer the same slow, wasting death as the rest of us. But that thought led to another, one I couldn't shake. What would they do when I was gone? I was the only one taking care of them. I had tried to keep up with them all, but there were just so many of them. And images in my head of once proud beasts, shriveled and mummified in their tombs after everyone who was to care for them drifted off into the beyond. I couldn't bear the idea. One day, two of my remaining colleagues, Elliot and Maria, found me staring into the tiger habitat, lost in thought. They looked as tired as I felt. "We need to talk," Elliot said. Maria nodded, rubbing at her eyes. "We don't have much time left." We all knew what she meant. We'd spent our lives working to protect endangered species, to care for the creatures we loved. But what was going to happen to them now? When the last of us were gone, and when there was no one left to open the gates, to make sure they didn't starve in their cages, what then? Maria was the first to say it out loud. "We have to let them go." At first, the thought felt like an admission of failure. We'd spent so long keeping them safe, keeping them contained, keeping them protected. But there was no protection anymore. The world was falling apart, and soon there would be no one left to keep the doors locked. Better to open them ourselves. Better to give them a chance. We sat together that night, huddled in the staff lounge, making a plan. It wasn't about setting them loose all at once. We had to be careful. Some of them could fend for themselves easily. Others would definitely struggle, and some would certainly die eventually. The predators especially needed help, needed to be released in a way that gave them the best chance. We mapped it all out, knowing full well we probably wouldn't be around to see if it worked. It didn't matter. We weren't doing it for us. We were doing it for them. What little government remained didn't try to stop us. They barely acknowledged us at all. The world had bigger fish to fry, so it were. More problems than a handful of zookeepers unlocking cages. But we didn't do it in secret. We sent out messages to other collections, other caretakers around the world. Those who were still awake. Those who still had the strength to act. We explained our reasoning, our fears, that soon these animals, many of them species we had driven to the brink of extinction ourselves, would waste away in derelict enclosures, starving in the worst fate imaginable, in the shadow of a dying world. This was the last thing we could do. One last mercy. Of course, there was resistance. Some called it reckless, irresponsible, that we would cause ecological collapse by introducing captive animals into wild spaces. That predators would hunt unchecked, that invasive species would spread uncontrollably. But the truth was, none of that mattered anymore. We knew that eventually nature would sort it all out. The world had already collapsed. The old rules, the ideas we had, the ones meant to keep balance in a world run by humans, no longer applied. And so the keepers of the world's last menageries made their choice. It started with quiet releases, then grew into something more. Soon, videos began to spread online, not as breaking news, not as viral content, but something softer, something more like a final act of grace. A small group in Belgium, their hands trembling with fatigue, guided a family of gorillas into the thick brush of the Congo, watching as the great apes hesitated before disappearing into the greenery. A near-empty aquarium in Dubai, its remaining staff gathering on a dock, murmuring quiet farewells as they tipped open transport tanks, watching sleek-bodied sharks slip silently into the sea. Wolves in Scotland, their enclosures unlocked, padded cautiously into the open countryside, confused at first, their sharp eyes flicking back toward their keepers as if waiting for instruction. But there was no instruction to give, only the gentle motion of hands ushering them forward. And so they went, slipping into the mist-draped hills like ghosts of a world that once was, their keepers left behind, teary-eyed, yet smiling. No grand announcements, no celebration, just release. Somewhere deep down, we all knew this was our legacy. Not the cities we built, not the machines we worshipped, not the history we so meticulously recorded. The last thing humanity would give this world would not be skyscrapers or monuments or art. It would be open cages. Once the idea took hold, once people realized there was nothing left to wait for, no cure, no rescue, no tomorrow, where everything would be fixed, everyone got involved. Children took their pet turtles to the rivers, whispering quiet goodbyes as they slipped into the water. Goldfish, poured into ponds by giggling kids, darted away under lily pads, oblivious to the weight of the moment. Solemn-faced parents stood nearby, watching their children play, smiling thinly even as the exhaustion behind their eyes deepened. It felt good to let go of something on your own terms. By month 7, the world had all but stopped. The lights went out first. Then the water pressure stopped, the taps running dry. The silent grid, the motionless streets, the blinking red lights of dead cell towers standing like gravestones in an abandoned world. It all felt inevitable. The people who kept the infrastructure running had likely faded away in their chairs, their heads slumped against cold desks. One by one, the last signals of human progress winked out. The last video I ever watched was a short, grainy clip, buffering slowly, the internet barely holding together in its final moments. A wealthy family in Texas had gathered outside their sprawling ranch, one of those private reserves built to house exotic animals far from their native lands. The camera panned shakily across the iron gates as they swung open. Rhinos, their great bodies lumbering forward, snorted dust into the dry air. Bison, ancient and shaggy, kicked up clouds of red earth as they thundered out into the open. Giraffes, their heads swaying like slow pendulums, stepped cautiously beyond the fences that had once contained them. And then elephants, actual elephants, moving with grace, their trunks brushing against the metal as they passed through, into the wild scrublands of the Lone Star State, where they had never belonged, but now had no choice but to make do. The video stuttered, froze. Then the screen went black, and that was it. No more news, no more updates, no more voices carried through wires and airwaves. The last thing I saw of the world before it truly ended was not war, or riots, or desperation. It was the sight of something ancient and powerful stepping beyond the boundaries we had built for it. It was freedom. It was bittersweet, though, because I was alone. I don't know why I lasted this long. I told myself for a while that maybe I was immune, that maybe I was one of the rare few people who could resist it, who could stay awake while the world faded into silence. Even as I watched billions of people, entire nations, slip away into the long dark, I felt fine. Even as I unlocked the last cages, as I watched creatures disappear into the wild places we had stolen from them, as the last lights blinked out and the last voices fell quiet. I was still here, still awake. And then one by one, I lost them all. My colleagues, my friends, the people I had fought alongside in those final months, clinging to our last scraps of purpose as everything else crumbled. Elliot was the first of us to go. We found him slumped against the otter enclosure, a bag of fish clutched in his sleeping hands. We buried him in the field behind the staff cabins, though we knew he would not be the last. Maria held on longer, long enough to see the last of the animals go, long enough to go watch the wolves disappear into the mist. She smiled at me before she went to bed one night, said she'd see me in the morning. She never woke up. One by one, the voices around me faded, the people I loved gone, swallowed by the sickness that spared no one. No one but me. At first, I clung to the idea I was different, that there was a reason I was still standing when the rest of the world had fallen, that maybe somewhere out there others like me were holding on, waiting to be found. But if there were, I never heard from them. Now the zoo is empty. The cities are empty. And I am still here. I survived for a time on what the others had left behind. Canned food, bottled water, whatever I could scavenge from the empty homes and abandoned stores. I didn't bother rationing at first. Old habits die hard, and somewhere in my mind I still believe supply chains would restart, that someone somewhere was rebuilding. But as the months dragged on, and I remained the only heartbeat in the ghost of a world that once teemed with billions, I stopped pretending. The world was not ours anymore. And I had no other goal but to exist and watch. I wandered the woods of my home in southern England, places that had once been still and quiet, where the only sounds had been the rustling of leaves and the occasional birdsong. But now the land rumbled with hooves, feral cattle, the herds growing larger with each passing season, moving like ghosts through the overgrown pastures. I once saw a shape move through the fog at dawn, something lean and powerful, its golden eyes catching the morning light before vanishing into the trees. A leopard. There'd been stories even before all of this of private collections of wealthy estates that had hoarded exotic animals behind their walls and ironed gates. Some had been responsible, many had not, and now those gates stood open, their keepers long asleep. Once I climbed the ruins of a crumbling motorway overpass, just to see the world from above. I liked to do that. In the distance, across the rolling green of the countryside, I saw elephants moving slowly through the fields, their great bodies casting long shadows in the golden light of evening. A piece of me wanted to laugh, another piece wanted to weep. This was not the world we had known. But it was still a world, and I was still here. It took 5 years. 5 years of wandering. 5 years of watching the world rebuild itself in ways it was never meant to be. 5 years of being the last ghost in a world that no longer belonged to me. And then, finally, it came for me. I had thought for a time that I had escaped it, that I was different, that I would outlast it all. But when I started sleeping longer than I meant to, when I awoke to find days had slipped through my fingers like sand, I knew my time had come. By the 3rd week, my body had wasted away, nothing but skin stretched over brittle bones. a miracle that nothing had found and consumed me whilst I slept. The longest I had been under was 3 days. When I awoke, the thirst was unbearable, the hunger almost worse. My hands shook as I forced myself to move, my body begging me to lie back down, to let me sleep. But not yet. I decided then that the next time I closed my eyes would be my last, that I would choose where it happened. So I walked. I climbed to the top of a hill where an old town had once stood. Now young forests swallowed the ruins, small trees pushing up through the crumbling roads, their roots cracking pavement like paper. The ghosts of the past danced in the morning light, and for a moment I swore I could see them. People I had known, people I had loved, moving in the shadows of a life long gone. Curious little monkeys watched me from chestnut trees, their little golden eyes glinting with curiosity. They were new here, descendants of escapees, perhaps, from some long-forgotten sanctuary. I smiled at them as I walked, reminiscing on all that I had done, all that I had seen. At the peak, I sat down and looked out over the world one last time. To the east, wolf dogs ran deer through the glades, their howls carrying on the wind. In the valley below, an elephant, wild and unchained, cradled her newborn against her massive body as they moved through the tall grasses. Somewhere far to the south, hyenas whooped and cackled in the twilight, their voices filling the empty spaces where human laughter had once been. Overhead, eagles soared, carried by the rising thermals, watching as I watched. And I felt it then. Peace. Not despair, not fear. Just the quiet understanding that this was the way things were meant to be. This neo-primordial world. I lay down on my side, curling into myself as I watched the world move on without me. Night is coming now. My eyes are heavier than before. I have tucked these writings away into an old lead box, burying it beneath me in the hopes that someday, something, someone might find it and know that I was here. The night chorus swells around me, the songs of life filling the dark. But not me. I sigh, not making a sound as I close my eyes. Finally, going quietly into the night.